Good evening there, everybody. Boxing Realist here, and hopefully you all are having a wonderful day today. I thought that I would review this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And I'm going to make this intro, fairly quick because I kind of want to get into this, bury the hatchet a little bit, as they would say, and talk about this because, of course, this is the channel, I believe his name is Hitman Sports Media. He is a boxing channel who, of course, especially a lot talks about Mr. Terrence Bud Crawford because I believe that he is a very big Terrence Bud Crawford fan. But that being said, of course, this all started, for those of you that know, I ended up reviewing a video by him, I believe, several months ago, right before the Canelo and Crawford fight. And of course, there was probably certain things in the video that I said because knowing myself, I can be a very harsh and blunt critic. And of course, overall, he probably did not like them. And of course, that is very understandable. So not only am I here to somewhat bury the hatchet, but there were certain things that he said, of course, and this was a complete reaction video to one of the videos that I recently posted because I ended up posting a video not only as a reaction to his comment, but I probably will be doing a multitude of videos later on in the future, not only just reacting to your guys' comments, all your guys' comments, but on top of that, reacting to certain comments that I think overall, do need to be addressed. Because that's the reason why I created this whole channel in the first place. Many people try to place certain things in a certain perspective in order to make that the history of certain thing, but in all reality, that may not be the actual reality of that situation. That's where narrative comes in. That's where biases come in. That's where propaganda and political games come in. And I'm not about any of that. I'm about at least what I find to be the truth. I'm going to tell you what I see and what I know. Now am I always going to be right? I can't claim you that, but what I will tell you overall is that I do at least keep the same standards with fighters. At least so far from what I've seen. But many people, overall, they come on my channel and they believe, especially that I am a hater of Terrence Bud Crawford. And keep in mind that I am not a hater of Terrence Bud Crawford. Now, of course, that's the exact type of thing that a hater of someone would say. But Terrence Bud Crawford, when you just ask my personal opinion of him, Terrence Bud Crawford, in my personal view, is one of the most talented and high IQ boxers of all time. He's someone that can fight in almost any type of way that he wants to. He was debatably the true best fighter of his era, in my view, right there with Oleksandr Usyk. And he's someone that is debatably one of the 10 greatest boxers of all time. I think that all those praises you can label upon Terrence Bud Crawford. So obviously I have a very high opinion of him. But of course, one thing that I've said about Crawford for a very long time is that although he is an all-time great level fighter, this narrative especially, and this is a big part of the reason why I've reviewed Dante's Boxing Nation and Ego and Aki TV. People believe that I review their videos in order to take shots at them. I am not trying to, take shots at them or anything like that. Now, in some of my videos, I can be a very harsh critic. Anyone who, of course, has seen my videos knows that I can be very blunt, very harsh, I'm very truthful, and someone overall that just gets straight to the point, at least in terms of criticism. But understandably, I can understand how that can definitely rub a lot of people the wrong way. Point overall being is this: the reason why I especially review those channels, including also channels at times like Hitman, or that of other channels, although I am steering a little bit away from that, but I'm still going to do it every once in a while, or especially just review certain comments or conversations, is because, once again, many people will try to put, history in more of a propagandic light instead of what actually happened. And we all know that the LDBC and new media channels, a lot of them, especially guys like Dante, guys like that, they put things in a very, very, overall propagandic type of situation. Of course, they're not the only ones. ESPN does it as well. Ring Magazine does it as well. And that's why, of course, you also find me, at least at times, talking about them. Now, I may do it in a different way, but every once in a while, you'll still probably find me reviewing guys like Dante or something like that, or even other channels, because everyone, of course, has their story to tell. And on top of that, they have their agenda. And there's a lot of people out there, especially within the sport of boxing, that have an agenda. But the sport of boxing probably is the most propagandic sport out of any other sport. And every sport is propagandic to a degree. Tennis, for those of you that have ever seen my tennis videos, you know that I've talked about Novak Djokovic and basically their claim that Federer and Nadal are above Djokovic. It's so funny because Roger Federer was looked at as the greatest of all time, no question about it, because he got the most amount of Grand Slams. And then Djokovic, not only gets the most amount of Grand Slams, but breaks literally every statistic and title and has a winning record over every player of his generation. And they'll tell you that they're not quite sure if he's the greatest. So the point is, and he beat Federer more than what Federer beat him. But the point is that anyone who has watched any sport knows that there's definitely a certain amount of propaganda and there's a certain amount of politics, and Terrence Bud Crawford has been a very interesting story, but we're going to talk about that as it goes along, but that being stated, he brought up some very interesting points. He also brought up some points later on about my channel as well, because this was kind of a reaction to my video. So he mentioned me within this. So that's the main reason why I'm reviewing this. But that being stated, he brought some things up even later on about my points about Bernard Hopkins, Tommy Hearns, and also about Andre Ward. But some of those points overall that he also brought up, I've never even said on my channel. So I wanted to, kind of make that point clear. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what the man has to say.
What's going on, you guys? So I seem to be the subject of a debate, on this YouTube stuff when it comes to the sport of boxing. I guess you would say I have a rival or somebody that, I typically go back and forth with, and this all started because this dude wanted to do some reaction videos to some predictions I put out there, specifically the Terrence Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez fight. And, he said some remarks during these breakdowns of these videos that rubbed me the wrong way, and I personally didn't like it. I kept it is what it is, but some of the remarks didn't sit too well with me, and I've always remembered them. And obviously,
Yes, and I certainly apologize, at least with that of a hitman, but that also being stated, and I understand, me probably being a little bit of a less, harsh critic, but there are also some people out there who really should not be talking about the sport of boxing whatsoever. And that includes overall guys like Dante, Aki TV, and guys like that. And it's great that they have a big fan base. It's great that they have a big following. There's no problem with that whatsoever. But when you're going to go on your little tirades, in order to spread a whole bunch of false propaganda, in order to tear down certain fighters, like what some of those channels have done, especially, and once again, for those of you that have seen my channel for a long time, once again, you would know the whole reason why I started this channel was because of the Fury and Wilder situation. Because those channels were trying so hard in order to get so many people, especially a lot of the minorities, whether they be the Latinos or, but especially that of the black fan base, to get you to believe that Deontay Wilder was cheated when none of that shit was ever true. But, anyway, but let's continue.
Guys who follow my channel know that I was picking Terrence Crawford to win that fight, very convincingly. In fact, I even thought there was a high chance of Terrence Crawford stopping Canelo. But obviously I was wrong about that, but I was right on my prediction, and this dude clearly wasn't. Since then, I've seen a couple of videos that he's posted, and occasionally I'll comment on one of them just to talk some mess. But when it comes to Terrence Crawford on this dude's channel, he seems to never give Terrence Crawford his just due. It doesn't matter what he's done, his accomplishments.
Well, this is where I have to ask the question. What would you mean by just due? Because many people, of course, claim that you should give this fighter the just due, that you should give this guy his flowers, that you're quote-unquote hating this guy. But in all reality, you might be telling the truth on him. The truth is about Terrence Bud Crawford is that he's an all-time grade level fighter. In my view, he's on the same level as guys like a Roberto Duran, a Roy Jones Jr., a Pernell Whitaker, and guys like that. He's on those same guys' level. Now, when I say that, the troubling thing is that the Terrence Bud Crawford fan base especially, and I'm not talking about Hitman here necessarily, but so many of the Crawford fans or the Wilder fans or, even fans of other fan bases, even the Inoue fan base to a degree, they'll come in here and they'll say, how can you not give him credit for this, this, and this? He won this amount of titles. He won this amount of this. Well, you would have to know my standards, and my standards always are the resume first. So who have you fought that I would consider to be A grade level fighters? Now, that can be a debate to a degree, but there's only so much room for debate. And the thing is about, excuse me, the thing is about Terrence Bud Crawford is that especially many of these channels, which is why I reviewed so much about Crawford, they'll try to get you to believe that Terrence Bud Crawford has been the #1 pound-for-pound fighter ever since he beat Gamboa, which just doesn't make any sense. So, like there was this dude who I also believed in this comment section, he stated, I believe his name was, Boxing Expert 12 or whatever his name is, he commented in my comment section and said, you don't make any sense because the argument was never that Crawford was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter this whole time. Well, actually, no, you'd be wrong about that. It depends on who you ask. Because if you ask a lot of these LDBC and new media channels, That's exactly what they'll tell you. Because even before Terence Bud Crawford fought Deshaun Porter, they were trying to debate that he was over guys like Lomachenko and Canelo Alvarez when he wasn't facing shit for competition. And I know that people are not going to like that, but listen, at the end of the day, was Terence Bud Crawford, is he a guy that is remembered as the best of his generation? It's either him or Usyk in my personal view, but if you were to debate Terence Bud Crawford, no problem with that, especially after the wins that he got within his last 5 fights. The Majamov, Porter, Spence, and Canelo Alvarez wins, all those wins were huge. All right, so he has to get a great amount of credit for that. But before then, was he known for facing the best level of competition? No, he was not. Did Lomachenko at one time deserve to be over him on the pound-for-pound list? Yes, he did. Because in a way shorter amount of time, he had about probably just as many title fights, at least from what I know. And he was facing guys that were looked at the time as A-grade level fighters. Guillermo Rigondeaux, Nicholas Walters, Gary Russell Jr. And we can debate about, these guys and where they were at their point in time in their career. But the point is that these guys were looked at as true A-grade level talents. The problem is that no one really knew how great Victor Postol was. He had that great win over Matisse, but he pretty much lost every big fight after that. Now, in my view, that still is at least an A- level win. But the problem is that Crawford was getting near to like 35 fights, and the two best wins of his career was a Gamboa that really was completely outsized of the lightweight class and only really had moved up a couple of weight classes because he could not get any of the bigger fights at those lower weight classes, kind of like what Rigondeaux did against Lomachenko, although, of course, he moved up 2 weight classes simultaneously. Gamboa did it over time, but still, he was not supposed to be there. So the problem was, excuse me, for such a long time that it was not really known how great Crawford truly was, because although he always passed the eye test, the level of competition was just severely lacking. So when people tell you this stuff about how Crawford was blackballed from being the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, I'm sorry, but none of that was ever true. Terence Bud Crawford was a fighter that was always looked at as a great fighter, and to be quite honest with you, he was pretty much placed within the top 5 pound-for-pound throughout that whole entire era. And there are times, even though he always passed the eye test, that you could have even possibly put him lower just because of the level of competition that he was facing. And that goes for Mr. Naoya Inoue as well, because Naoya Inoue overall was someone that on my pound-for-pound list, he did not finally become top 5 pound-for-pound on my list until he beat that of a Fulton. And I always stated that. For those of you that also have seen my channel in the past, you would know that I also stated that Naoya Inoue was the most overrated pound-for-pound fighter on the list before he beat Stephon Fulton. So for those of you that have been around my channel long enough, you would know that I have also stated that. But anyways.
Accomplishments, his accolades, everything when it comes to Terence Crawford, there's always some sort of, him trying to diminish everything about Terence Crawford, whether it's his resume.
Well, there's nothing to diminish about Terence Bud Crawford. There's only, at least for me, telling the truth about Terence Bud Crawford. And the truth is about Terence Bud Crawford, especially after his most recent wins, he's an all-time grade level fighter. He's someone that, is a tremendous fighter. He's one of the highest IQ level fighters of all time. He's an intelligent fighter, and you have to put him in that same realm. I'm not quite sure if I would put him in the same realm as guys like Floyd Mayweather or Sugar Ray Robinson or guys like that, or whoever else you'd want to put at the top 3 spots. It's very hard to get within, that realm just because they have such a high resume. And of course, the Crawford fans ain't going to agree with that, but it just is what it is. Like, I believe I had one of these dudes, his name was Aloe or something like that. I don't remember. I think a man who also watches Hitman, he got on my channel, got all emotional, and was talking about, overall, well, Crawford would beat everyone on Mayweather's resume, and that's fantastic. But just because we believe a fighter would beat everyone on that guy's, resume, does that mean that they're on the same level? That doesn't make any sense. That's like me going to NBA basketball and saying like, well, you know what? I believe this player during that time would have won just as many championships, so I'm going to put him on the same level. You can never say that because at the end of the day, we still have to go off of hardcore evidence. All right, we have to go off of not only what they accomplished, but also who they beat. All right, we can't just take a look overall at someone and say, okay, well, they're on the same level because I believe that they would have beat this person. I believe that, there's a good chance that Oleksandr Usyk, could have beat a lot of, the opponents within heavyweight history. That doesn't mean that I just automatically put him as the greatest heavyweight of all time. You know what I mean? So I believe that, Ilya Topuria, in the UFC right now would beat probably the majority of the lightweight champions, or featherweight champions, especially within history. That doesn't just mean that I automatically put him there without hardcore evidence or a body of work. And that was the problem with Crawford and also Naoya Inoue, for example. They wanted to put them at the #1 pound-for-pound spot when they did not really have that body of work yet, at least against true A-grade level opponents, comparative to that of other guys. Because Lomachenko, by the time he became a 3-weight division champion, he had big fights against Jorge Linares, who was looked at as the best at 135. Now, understandably, at one time, Linares was not looked at as severely talented, but he had kind of evolved as a fighter, so one could debate that he was A- at that time. He also, and that was Lomachenko's third weight class, he also beat Rigondeaux, who was top 5 at the time, or top 10, although he clearly was smaller in that fight and went up a couple weight classes. And of course, he also ended up beating that of a Gary Russell Jr. and a Nicholas Walters. So Lomachenko was on an absolute tear. So when people try to tell you this stuff about how Lomachenko does not deserve to be over Crawford, no, that's completely false. And these people telling you that the only reason why they had Lomachenko at #1 was because of race and blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm sure that they were happy that a Caucasian fighter was #1. But you can't just sit here and tell people, overall all this horse shit about, well, the only reason why Crawford wasn't #1 was because he was black. It just doesn't make any sense, at least if you know what you're talking about. But anyways, let's continue.
The opponents he's beat, his accomplishments, so on and so.
And let me state this. Is this me saying that Lomachenko is greater than Crawford? Absolutely not. At the end of the day, because some of the losses that Lomachenko suffered to Lopez as well as Devin Haney, and because of such a short career, he cannot be compared on the same level as guys like a Crawford or an Usyk. He cannot be compared to them because overall those guys ended up proving that they were able to beat the fighters that were bigger than them or the same size as them. Lomachenko did not do enough to beat Teofimo Lopez. And, I mean, one could debate that he just did enough to beat Devin Haney, maybe. But in my view, it was very close, and it was not a clear victory. So, I mean, it just is what it is. So, Lomachenko, although he is a great fighter, maybe even an all-time great level fighter, he cannot be remembered on the same level as guys like Usyk, who were actually able to beat Fury, AJ, and everyone in the cruiserweight division. And he also cannot be remembered on the level of a guy like a Terrence Bud Crawford. And we'll see how Inoue does. Because Inoue, in my view, although he is an all-time great level talent, we still have to see, once again, where he goes. So that's why many people, even with my standards with Inoue, they'll say, what are you talking about? I need to see Inoue at the likes of 126 and also against the likes of not only Junto Nakatani, but also the likes of a Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez to see, and a Bruce Shushu Carrington, to see if Inoue belongs within the same realm of a Crawford or an Usyk. And with the amount of names that he has there, who knows? Maybe he'll even surpass him one day, but he's going to have to beat those names. So we'll see.
Forth, right? So he posted a video talking about Usyk fighting this kickboxer nobody's ever heard of, and I commented and said, if this was Bud Crawford, you would be bashing on him. I think Usyk's resume is completely overrated. He beat a fat Fury who arguably lost to an MMA fighter, came off 3 wars with Wilder, and was on dope for years. And then he beat a robot with no heart in Anthony Joshua, who got...
Well, let's just talk about this very quickly. First of all, I understand his comment about, the Rico situation. It is a terrible fight. It is not a fight that I want to see whatsoever. It is an awful fight. But in terms of his point of, I would criticize Bud if he did this. Well, the reason why I was so critical of Bud Crawford's resume for such a long time was because Bud Crawford was getting damn near to 40 fights and he just wasn't fighting anybody. And I'm not claiming that this is all his fault. But at the end of the day, and I know that people are going to disagree, but he could have signed with the PBC a very long time ago and probably at least had a chance of getting some of those bigger fights. I don't care what anybody says. At the end of the day, yes, when you sign with Bob Arum, a guy who is known for screwing over his fighters and notoriously known for also not working with Al Heyman and Showtime, yes, that is going to cause a major problem. So at the end of the day, Terrence Bud Crawford, although he wanted to play this game of, I want them all, and, overall, they can come to the other side of the street. Why can't you come to the other side of the street? At the end of the day, you apparently wanted all the big boys, so why do you sign with the guys, why do you sign with the name and the company overall that don't have any of the big boys? It doesn't make any sense. So at the end of the day, once again, that was one of the things that I was critical about Crawford. And I don't think that he was avoiding any of those guys. I just think that it was a very poor decision. But it is what it is. Now, of course, it didn't matter all that much in hindsight because Crawford, of course, ended up beating Spence and Canelo and those guys. But, of course, eventually when he finally got with Spence, I believe, that was when he finally signed with the PBC. At least I believe. But anyway.
Stopped by Andy Ruiz.
But, in terms of the Rico thing, it also depends on what point you are at your career. If Terrence Bud Crawford were to do that right now or after the Errol Spence win, you wouldn't really hear much from me because after a fighter pretty much does at least something that I think that they really need to do, there's not really much room for criticism in my view. Because Crawford has done everything at this point, so he can pretty much do whatever he wants to do. Now, if you're going to hold the titles like what an Oleksandr Usyk is going to do, and you're going to face MMA fighters, then yes, that is a little bit more of a problem. But the reason why I'm giving Usyk a little bit more of a break here is because he's basically accomplished almost everything he's needed to. And it's the same thing with Crawford, even after the Spence fight or after the Canelo fight. So if he were to fight an MMA fighter, at least right now, even if he still did have the titles, I wouldn't mind it that much. Although, yes, I don't think you should be doing that when you're holding the titles, especially if you're unified. But the point is that, Crawford and Usyk are at the point in their careers to where they could pretty much retire and call it a day. I mean, what else is Crawford really going to do? Yes, he could fight someone like a Jerome Boutzenis or someone else like that. But listen, at the end of the day, the man is a three-time undisputed champion. He beat Canelo. He beat Spence. He beat two of the best pound-for-pound fighters of his day. And Usyk pretty much did as well. He beat Fury and he beat AJ. Now, at the time, maybe you can debate that they weren't on the pound-for-pound list. I think AJ may have been on some lists. I think, according to my research, AJ was on some lists. But Fury was kicked off of most lists, of course, because of that terrible performance over Francis Ngannou. But I thought that he very clearly did not take him seriously. Now, the reason why my last video was the reason why it was is because if you're going to completely diminish Usyk's resume off of little stuff like this, then I think that you also should do it with Terence Bud Crawford. That was the point of my last video. Because, people overall, they talk about, Usyk or someone else, and they'll say, well, he faced him when he did this, he faced him when he did this. I remember when Dante and Aki TV, they used to say that Vasyl Lomachenko, that he fought Rigondeaux when he was a lot smaller, and Rigondeaux, was coming off of a year layoff. But yet there was no mention of Gamboa clearly being outside of that weight class. He started off at 126, and he really should have stayed at 126. Gamboa and even Crawford said that in an interview, and you've seen that in one of my most recent interviews. Gamboa was not a natural 135-pounder. And I understand that, this guy, what's his name? Not Hitman, but this guy that was in my comment section, boxing expert, he says, well, that's not Crawford's fault. No, it's not Crawford's fault. And it's great that he was still able to beat that of a Gamboa. But at the end of the day, how great a fighter is not just mainly going to be proved about beating an A-grade level fighter that you're clearly heavier than, you're way lengthier than, and you're just, fighting a guy that really does not belong in that weight class. I mean, that's the reason why I do not put guys like Tommy Hearns or Oscar De La Hoya or Bernard Hopkins in GOAT conversations. That's why almost no one puts those guys in GOAT conversations, because those guys had such physical talent. Oscar De La Hoya, and Tommy Hearns, they're around the same level, because Oscar De La Hoya was so successful even early against great fighters like Chavez and Whitaker and guys like that. But once he finally started facing guys that could actually handle that reach and his speed, then he started having problems. If you're an all-time greatly, level talented fighter, even like a De La Hoya or a Tommy Hearns, you can beat the smaller guys, even if they're all-time great level talented. But what are you going to do against guys that can actually handle your reach, handle your size? Because I'm not going to say anybody can, but, if you're an all-time greatly talented physical fighter and, just skilled fighter in general, any of those fighters can beat fighters that are way smaller than them. I mean, how hard is that? If David Benavidez, overall, were to fight Terence Bud Crawford right now, David Benavidez can, probably beat Terence Bud Crawford because of his sheer size alone. How impressive is that? So the point is that, yes, we do have to judge off of those standards to a degree, but my point is, just to talk about, excuse me, the Fury situation. To bring up the Fury dope situation, to me, that is somewhat of an invalid excuse. And not to, once again, criticize this guy or anything like that, but to me, that's somewhat of an invalid excuse, because the last time Tyson Fury had, dope issues was before the Deontay Wilder fight. Tyson Fury came back, and he was thought to maybe not quite be the same again. And then he came back, beat the shit out of one of the top 3 heavyweights in the world, overall, and then came back and was looked at as the best heavyweight of his generation. And then beat a top-level contender in Dillian White. Didn't even have him win a round and knocked him out in 6 rounds. And, I mean, you can try to debate all this stuff about how talented you think this heavyweight division is and all this other stuff. But let's just not sit here and act like Tyson Fury was washed up here. Now, he did have a very terrible performance over Francis Ngannou. That probably is the most valid point. But in terms of the dope situation, I mean, that to me is completely invalid, because I don't know how you'd be even able to use that. because the last time he had dope issues was before he beat Deontay Wilder, and we all know that Fury was at a great point in defeating someone like a Deontay Wilder, who was a top-level heavyweight of his era. Overrated to a degree? Yes. Someone that was wild in his skill set? Yes. But someone that was still very, very powerful, and someone that was a threat. So it is what it is. But anyways, so that's my point. If you're going to use that for certain fighters, you have to keep the same standards. Now Fury did, almost lose to Ngannou, but I thought that it was also fairly obvious for anyone who was watching. He didn't take that fight seriously whatsoever. So my point is that if you're going to talk about how AJ is this robot with no heart, Danny Dubois is a quitter, blah, 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 well, we also should talk about the stuff with Terrence Bud Crawford. That was my point. We need to talk about how Gambo was out for a year and how overall, once again, how he was clearly smart for the weight class. Now, to me, those are not valid enough excuses, but neither are the ones with the Usyk. What I was saying in that video, and I think some people missed the point, was that if you're going to label those with Terrence Bud Crawford or label those with Usyk, you should do them for both fighters. We should label how Gambo was out for over a year, probably a little rusty, did not belong in that weight class. We should mention overall how Majimov only had 11 total fights. We should mention how Spence had multiple car accidents, and already had wars with guys like Sean Porter and Kell Brook and guys like that. And people were talking about him not looking the same. We should talk about that. We should talk about how people talked about Canelo for years, that he was not looked at as the same. If you're going to apply those standards, but don't just do it with one fighter because you want to make your favorite fighter look better. So that's my point. But anyways.
Like, those are his claim to fame, fights that, put him on the map, in my opinion. Because nobody, and I challenge anybody watching this video to name me one dude at cruiserweight without looking at BoxRec. Just name one dude off rip. Like, think about it. I'm not telling you to go in my comment section.
Well, I can name you almost every single one of the guys that Usyk fought. And of course, that dude, all-time great boxing, or what the hell's his name? I remember name like Dory remembers everything in the fucking movie Finding Nemo. I apologize. I'm terrible with names. But anyways, that being said, Boxing Expert 12, that's what his name is. He stated that the cruiserweight division that is not talented, regular to that of the welterweight division. Well, you can debate that for most eras. But ever since the Usyk era, that is when the cruiserweight division really reached its golden age peak. That's when you started seeing talent from a lot of other countries. Murat Gassiev, who right now is a top 10 contender at the heavyweight division, even though he really does not belong there. You had Junior Dordikos. You had that of a Maris Bradis. You had that of a Michael Hunter. You had that still of a David Haye and Tony Bellew there. Now, I'm not saying that all these guys are A-grade level fighters, but the cruiserweight division was absolutely stacked. It was about the same level of talent, in my view, as what Andre Ward had to go through when he was undisputed, or not undisputed, I don't think, but when he was basically the major champion there at 168. It was about as talented as that, because guys like Murat Gassiev, Maris Bradis, Glavacki, those guys are around the same level as a Mikhail Kessler. Now, Mikhail Kessler is not someone that I would put on this top 5 pound for pound level, but he is someone that I would claim as an A- level fighter. Those guys, in my view, were at least on the same level as a guys like a Mikhail Kessler, and some of them around the level of a Carl Frosch. Were they, Spence or Canelo? Not necessarily, but overall anyways. But point being is that no, Usyk defeated a lot of great names there. His first champion there was Glavacki, who beat the shit out of Marco Huck. And Marco Huck is, debatably around that B plus A minus level, especially, around that area. But he's someone overall that still was very good. He is a little bit straight. He is a, a German crowd fighter. They usually fight very stiff and very straight. But I mean, the point is that he still was looked at as a danger for a very long time. Usyk still beat him at a good point. But even if you want to count him as a B-grade level fighter, the Polish undefeated fighter Glavacki, he was a real deal fighter who could truly box. He was someone that was at least an A- level fighter. He was at the very least on the same level as a Postol, if not better, just in my view. Murat Gassiev definitely was. He was another A-grade to A- level fighter, especially for the cruiserweight division. He knocked out the undefeated Cuban talent in Junior Dordikos. And, of course, you also have Maris Bradis. I don't remember where he's from. I think like Latvia or something like that. I don't remember. You have Michael Hunter there, and there might be one other name that I'm forgetting. But there's Murat Gassiev, Michael Hunter, Glavacki, and Maris Bradis. I think there's one other name that I'm not remembering there. But those are at least, 3 to 4 A-grade level wins that he has right there. So, yes, his cruiserweight run was fairly impressive.
comment it, because you guys can all go and do that. But if you're going to be completely honest, nobody knows anybody he fought at cruiserweight, right?
Well, I can't agree with that. I would say that the people that A, don't care about the cruiserweight division, or the people that have not seen Oleksandr Usyk's career there would say overall that they have not seen it. But a lot of us ended up seeing it because that was the first time, really, and for a very long time, that the cruiserweight division actually even had a pulse. It was filled, overall to the top with undefeated fighters, and you still had some older veterans there like Tony Bellew and David Haye. David Haye was a little bit older. He was kind of shot, especially after that first fight with Tony Bellew, because I think he tore his Achilles. But there were still some fighters there that were very, 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 very talented, and they were very new, and they were Olympic level fighters. So when you have people telling you like Usyk didn't fight talented cruiserweight fighters, no, he very much did. Now, if it would have been, the generation right before that of the Marco Huck era, that was a very weak era. But the cruiserweight division that Oleksandr Usyk was a part of, it was rife to the brim with undefeated talent from everywhere. Eastern Europe, with Russia, and other places, Latvia, Cuba, America, Britain. So no, that was probably the most talented cruiserweight division ever. And ever since then, you've still had very good names there, like Martis Bradis. You've had, now Jai Opetaia. So the cruiserweight division, pretty much ever since Usyk's entry, has really become much more talented. And now take a look at it. Now you got David Benavidez, Gilberto Soto Ramirez, Jai Opetaia. So the cruiserweight division, really ever since Usyk's era, has really started to grow.
But let this guy tell you that Oleksandr Usyk is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So any chance I get, I like to bash on Usyk, and it's not even necessary.
Well, what I'm going to personally say is this, and people can like this, they can not like this, but this is just the facts of the matter. Usyk's run, at cruiserweight, although I'm not going to call it the greatest undisputed run of all time, Oleksandr Usyk's unification was probably the hardest unifications out of any other fighter, at least of this current era, and possibly even comparative to Terrence Bud Crawford, unless, maybe you want to count combined with 147 to 168. But I would even say Usyk, because he literally had to face all the undefeated guys at cruiserweight to get the belts. Like, he fought all those guys, and some of those guys were Olympic level fighters that were undefeated and had real belts. And then he goes up to heavyweight, he faces Fury when he finally takes a fight seriously. And Fury is, although he wasn't pound for pound because of that terrible performance over Ngannou. But the reason why I don't really put that into account that much is because Tyson Fury is someone who always fights to the level of his competition. He'll have a terrible performance over Otto Wallin, almost damn near lose the fight, have a cut that, looks like he got hit with a machete on the side of his face, and then overall in his next fight, he'll have the best performance of all time against Deontay Wilder, or at least the best performance in his career. So that's why Tyson Fury, you have to know each fighter individually as a fighter and what they're like. Because there are some fighters that fight to the level of the competition. Tyson Fury was one of those fighters. All right. So I knew when he was coming into the Usyk fight that this was going to be a way different Tyson Fury. And then in terms of the talking points about, Fury being quote unquote fat, well, Fury's always looked a little bit flabby as a fighter. But he's always been someone that has shown great stamina in his biggest fights, great boxing ability. And Usyk was able to beat an A-grade level boxer, the best heavyweight of his era, and he was way bigger than him. That's why that was so special. And Fury at one time was a pound-for-pound fighter. And to be honest, he pretty much still was a pound-for-pound fighter. He just had a terrible performance because he had underestimated Francis Ngannou so terribly. He was completely out of shape in that fight compared to his usual standards. And on top of that, he did not take him seriously at all. But anyone, of course, who's seen that knew that Tyson Fury changed a lot for the Usyk fight. He's just going to get past him.
That I dislike Usyk. It's just his fan base, and more than likely, everybody that's a big fan of Usyk, does the same thing that this guy does, and his name is Boxing Realist. They all bash on Terrence Crawford and try to diminish him to big up Usyk, right? And you guys know I've been...
Yes, and I've seen many of the Terrence Crawford fans do the same thing with Usyk in any way as well. So what my channel is here for, once again, is to put the same standards, on the occasion. But anyway.
Very critical on Usyk, and I think he is overrated. I think he would get destroyed by any 90s heavyweight. I would say some of the 80s heavyweights. If you're talking Tyson in the 80s, I think Larry Holmes would probably beat him. The 70s heavyweights, you got guys like Foreman, Ali, Joe Frazier.
I want to talk about George Foreman very quickly. because, that guy in my, comment section, Mr. Boxing Expert, he says, well, if you compare the fighters of the heavyweight division, they're nowhere near as talented as the guys like Crawford had to fight at welterweight. Well, you can say that if you want to, but the truth of the matter is that AJ and Fury, for especially super heavyweights, they were exceedingly talented. This is not the era, of the smaller, swifter heavyweights. This is, excuse me, this is the era of the bigger super heavyweights that at times can be, swifter, but oftentimes use their size and their power, and are very, very exceptionally talented. AJ and Tyson Fury, yes, they would have been able to compete in other eras, and Usyk absolutely would have been able to. Do I believe that Usyk would have just lost to any 90s or 80s or 70s heavyweight? No, I do not. And this narrative overall about, well, these guys, they don't move that well, blah, blah, blah. There were heavyweights that became or were known as some of the greatest fighters of all time, and they were not known to be the greatest of movers. When you take a look at Sonny Liston, he's known as one of the greater heavyweights of all time. Take a look at his movement. He's not the best mover. He had very slow feet. He was someone that did not have the best feet, did not have the best head movement. Does that mean that Muhammad Ali should not be regarded as a top 10 level heavyweight of all, or excuse me, as a top 10 level fighter of all time? Because if you also take a look at George Foreman, is George Foreman really the most skilled heavyweight fighter of all time? George Foreman, to be quite honest with you, and even he would have told you this when he was, still alive, that George Foreman had about, one game plan and that was it, but George Foreman was still a great fighter. Is he going to be someone that fights the exact same way as a Mayweather or a Leonard or someone like that? No. But the point is that the heavyweight division, they fight in different ways because their talents aren't always speed. Their talents aren't always quicker feet. Their talents aren't always this. So that's why, when I get people that come into my comment section and compare a heavyweight fighter to a fighter that's at like 147 or 135, you can't compare the exact same skill sets. You can try if you want to, but the point is that the heavyweight fighters are never, ever, ever going to look the same as the lighter weight fighters, and vice versa. It's never going to be the same. Take a look at Artur Beterbiev, for example. Artur Beterbiev, people take a look at him, overall as if he is one of the top fighters in the world. He's a little bit stiff, he's a little bit hittable, but he's someone that makes it work at the light heavyweight division. Does that mean that Artur Beterbiev should not be counted as one of the best fighters in the world? Because he looks like that? And a lot of those guys at light heavyweight don't move like the guys at 147. So my point is that, now we could of course ask the question, what if, Artur Beterbiev was shrunk down, would he win against the elite guys at 147? Who the hell knows? But the thing is that we don't know what Artur Beterbiev would fight like or what those guys would fight like if they were forced to be in different weight classes. I don't go off of that because we're never going to know the answer to that. So the point overall is once again, you have to go off of the talent for that weight class. Now, is it obvious that there are certain eras that have no talent or not a lot of talent? Yes. The Larry Holmes era was an era, for example, that did not have a lot of talent. When you take a look at a lot of those fighters, when you take a look at the Mike Tyson era, that was an era that had almost no talent. And I'm talking about the era where Mike Tyson was a unified champ, not the 90s after he got defeated by Buster Douglas. I'm talking about the Pingleton Thomas, James Bone Crusher Smith, Tony Tucker era. That was probably the worst heavyweight era of the past 40 plus years. But anyway.
Some of those guys.
But once again, take a look at the way that George Foreman fights. Does that mean that Muhammad Ali's win over George Foreman, that we need to not count it as that elite of a win anymore because because Foreman's skill set doesn't stack up against the likes of a Manny Pacquiao or Miguel Cotto? Or do we compare it, overall correctly because they're heavyweight fighters? We cannot compare a heavyweight fighter to that of a complete lower weight class fighter. It just doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, those have not been the past standards. Anyways.
I would say could probably be Usyk, right? But I don't think Usyk is to the caliber of fighter that everybody says he is. But when you go by the numbers, right? When you look at the records, when you look at the fact of the matter, right? Terence Crawford's resume is far more superior than an Oleksandr Usyk.
Well, that, of course, is not something that I can agree with. What I will personally state is this. If you were to make the point that Crawford fought some of those pound-for-pound guys when they actually were on the pound-for-pound list, that probably is your best argument. But in my view, Usyk, I think that he fought AJ when he was on some top 10 pound-for-pound list. And on top of that, he did fight Fury when he probably didn't deserve to be on the pound-for-pound list, but he was someone that still had pound-for-pound potential. He just had that shitty performance over Ngannou because he didn't take him seriously whatsoever. He said, this dude's an MMA fighter. he's not going to be able to do shit. I'm going to go in there, overall and completely blister this guy up within, several rounds. I'm going to have a little bit of fun with this. And then when he figured out that Ngannou knew a little bit more than what he thought he did, and that he was a little bit tougher, he did not have the conditioning nor the training in that fight to actually have a better performance. He did just enough to pull out that fight, but he damn near lost it.
Right. When it comes to champions beaten, he's beaten 11 current or former world champions. Usyk's only beaten 7, right?
Well, we can count that if you want to. But the problem also is, and I compare standards like this, Terrence Crawford has had 42 total fights in his career. So the fact that he's only fought, whatever the stat is, about 11, former or, some whatever champions, I mean, to me, it's not really as impressive. Now, don't get it twisted. Am I claiming that it's not impressive? No. But the point is that Oleksandr Usyk has about, what, half the fights of a Terrence Crawford? And the fact that their, listed champions are not that far off, it just makes Usyk look that much more better.
When it comes to undefeated fighters, I believe Crawford's beat 9 undefeated fighters throughout the course of his career. Usyk's only beat 3, and really none of them.
Well, we also have to ask ourselves, how much is it really worth to beat an undefeated fighter? Because if we take a look at Inoue, for example, I can take a look at Emmanuel Rodriguez, who was undefeated. I can take a look at other fighters who were undefeated. I believe that Inoue just defeated the undefeated David Picasso. Does that mean that Inoue should be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter? Do I take a look at Inoue and say, you know what? He defeated some undefeated fighters, so I think that that's a much better win than Usyk's win over AJ Anthony Joshua or Floyd Mayweather's win over Miguel Cotto or Marquez, because they already had losses. So although I understand what he's trying to say, when you talk about undefeated fighters, to me, that only really matters if you're facing undefeated fighters that were super high quality. Now, I mean, you can count the undefeated fighters if you want to make the point about, well, we don't know how good those fighters would have ended up. I mean, that's up to you. But a lot of the undefeated fighters that Crawford fought, if we're going to be real, they were not exceedingly talented. And, I understand that certain people will disagree. That's not me trying to diminish his resume. It's just the truth. Now, when you talk about not Canelo, when you talk about Spence, when you talk about Majimov and Postol, yeah, and Gamboa, yeah, those guys were talented. But when you talk about, Aegis Kavalauskas, Jose Benavidez, when you talk about Jeff Horn, Julius Ndango, those guys were not exceedingly talented. They just were not.
Other than Fury, were of real note. I think Michael Hunter and some other dude that nobody's ever heard of that he's beat.
Well, I would never, at least this is me. I'm not going to go off the opponents, and their, quality just because they have an undefeated record. Because take a look at Floyd Mayweather, for example. Floyd Mayweather is someone, in my view, that probably has the greatest resume of all time. He, in my view, is probably the most complete all-around fighter of all time. And I would probably debate him as the greatest fighter ever, just in my view, at least for boxing, obviously. But the point is that if you take a look at a lot of the biggest wins in his career, they already had lost. Mosley had already lost several times. Cotto had already lost a couple times. Pacquiao had lost several times. Now that's not to say, of course, like he did not have his share of undefeated guys. He defeated a undefeated Canelo. He defeated an undefeated Diego Corrales and an undefeated Ricky Hatton. But a lot of the fighters that he fought also had lost. Marquez, Pacquiao, Cotto, De La Hoya, other guys, Jose Luis Castillo, Carlos Baldomir, Zab Judah. So does that mean that those are not A-grade level wins, or that they cannot have the same level of value of an undefeated fighter, even if they're clearly not an A-grade level fighter? I just don't know if I can go off of those standards.
That was undefeated. And the big thing to me is, people say, oh, the resume this, the resume that. But when you look at the resume, what current pound-for-pound fighter has Oleksandr Usyk beat? You can't say Fury because...
Well, Fury was taken off the pound-for-pound list, and that's something that probably would be, his best point. But I do still count that as a high-level pound-for-pound win because, to me, it was fairly obvious that he did not take that Ngannou fight seriously whatsoever. He performed so awful. I mean, Fury did not even move out of the way after he threw punches. And that's just not Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury is someone that, of course, is not flawless as a fighter. But he's someone that's a lot better than what he performed in the Ngannou fight. That's why I say Fury is someone that you have to know him as a fighter. He'll perform like shit one fight when he doesn't take that opponent seriously. Fury is just one of those guys to where he needs true motivation in order to put on a great performance. And, say whatever you want to about Fury, but whenever Fury has usually shown up in a fight, he usually shows up. He beat Vladimir Klitschko, and I know that people are going to say, well, he was washed up. And no, Klitschko was not washed up. To me, there are 4 levels of fighters. You know, there are peak level fighters, there are prime level fighters, there are faded level fighters, and then there are washed up level fighters. You can say that Klitschko maybe was starting to fade, or that he was at a prime faded version, but you can't say he was washed. Because a person that A is washed is still not going to be a unified champion more than likely, unless you're like a Sergio Martinez, you know, where you were completely done after that knee tear, you know, and they basically gave you the decision over Martin Murray. But I mean, unless it's a situation like that, no. And it was very obvious that Klitschko was not washed up, because a year after that, even after a year layoff, he damn near knocked out H.A. Anthony Joshua in one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time. And, you know, damn near knocked out the much younger, undefeated champion in AJ, the guy who was looked at as the next upcoming heavyweight guy. So, I mean, it was fairly obvious that Klitschko was just not completely washed. Then he beat Deontay Wilder. Was he a bit overrated? Yes. Massively overrated at times? Yes. But he was someone that was still one of the top heavyweights of his day, and someone that was looked at as, you know, better than a lot of those contenders. Now, was he truly? Who knows? But, you know, Deontay Wilder, at the very least, did get those 2 victories over Luis Ortiz. So I think it's safe to say, at least for a heavyweight, that he was at least an A- level fighter. And take a look at George Foreman. He was basically the George Foreman of his day. He was not the most skilled. He was someone that showed a lot of heart. He did not have a plan B or C, but he was someone that could hit very hard, and he was someone that, with that plan A, was a relatively great fighter, just like George Foreman. Now, do I think that he's greater than George Foreman? No. But, you know, every generation has one of those fighters. And if you're going to consider that George Foreman was an A-grade level fighter, then yes, guys like Deontay, you should also count them as A-grade level fighters as well. Anyways.
Fury wasn't a current pound-for-pound fighter when Usyk fought him. In fact, they kicked him off of the pound-for-pound top 10 because he looked so horrible against Francis Ngannou, a fight in which he arguably lost, right? So in this dude's video, you know, because he did like 3 videos now based off one comment I made, right?
Well, I did one video responding to you, sir, but then I had to make a couple more videos because this dude, you know, what's his name? Why the fuck do I keep forgetting his name? You know, Boxing Expert 12. This man literally wrote me like 3 chapters in my comment section. So I had, you know, I couldn't just respond to that, you know, overall with the thing. I had to respond to that, you know, within a video. Anyway, and don't get it twisted, you know, I don't mind long comments, but you know, with super long comments like that, I gotta do a response to that within a video, because I can't just go back and forth in the comments all day long like that. So anyway, but thank you all for your comments. And that wasn't even the only person I had to respond to. I had to respond to John Boxing. I had to respond, not John Boxing, excuse me, Sean. You know, I believe I had to respond to St. Don. I had to respond to a few people. Anyways, love y'all.
In this dude's video, he says, oh, Terrence Crawford's got 6, you know, A-grade level marquee names on his resume. I can only say maybe 2 for Usyk.
I would say for Usyk, he has at least 6. He has Bradis, he has Gassiev, and he has Glavacki for cruiserweight, you know, and then at heavyweight, he has AJ, Danny Dubois, and Tyson Fury. And we're going to go into them, you know, a little bit later. But anyway, you know, but you could potentially add guys like Marco Huck, Morris Bradis, not Morris Bradis, excuse me, Michael Hunter, you know, and Tony Bellew, potentially. But those are the more debatable ones, you know. But to be fair, Morris Bradis gave Jai Opetaia, I believe, a very tough fight. I think it was obvious he was an A-grade level fighter. Murat Gassiev recently became a top 10 level guy at the heavyweight division. And, you know, I believe has only ever lost once or twice in his career. Michael Hunter, the only loss he's ever taken was against Usyk. And to be fair, he did get a draw against Alexander Povetkin in his first move up there, I believe, in kind of an upset, to be honest with you. And I know that Povetkin was older, but just because a fighter is older still does not mean that they're not a great part of that weight class. You have, you know, guys like that every once in a while, especially when you're taking steroids like that of an Alexander Povetkin did. But anyway.
So are we being serious when we're having this? Is there really even a debate? I don't think there is. But when you look at Crawford's resume, he wanted to talk about Gamboa being undersized, and he had a fight at 135 prior, and he was on the top 10 pound-for-pound list at the time. That
Well, when we actually talk about, you know, Yuriorkis Gamboa being on the top 10 pound-for-pound list, I never truly counted Gamboa as a top 10 level pound-for-pound fighter. Just my view. Now, was he on one top 10 pound-for-pound list, I believe, at one time? Like, I believe he was on World Boxing top 10 pound-for-pound. Was he ever on Ring Magazine or ESPN? No, he wasn't ever on those lists, at least according to my knowledge. If I'm wrong, then certainly feel free to correct me. But the point is that Gamboa was someone that, and these are just my own standards. You don't have to agree with them, but it's just my view. Gamboa was someone that, although he was around top 20, top 10, maybe at one time, he was someone that really just did not do enough, in my view, to ever truly deserve top 10. AJ and Fury, I can kind of understand, even though they're heavyweights, because, they beat certain guys, in my view, that could put them there. But Gamboa was someone that, who did he really ever beat? That's A, in terms to put him up there. And B, he only ever won one belt within one weight class. I just don't think that that's enough to really put him up there. All the other belts that he won in other weight classes were either interim or regular titles. He won the IBF featherweight title, and other than that, he never won any other titles in his career. And I'm talking about real titles, not regular titles, not interim titles. Because anyone, of course, who knows me knows that I don't count those fucking titles. Anyway.
Crawford had fought him. Earl Spence, same thing. Canelo Alvarez, same thing. There's 3 dudes right off rip that are on the top 10 pound for pound list.
Well, 2 dudes at least for sure. Gamboa is more of a debate. I wouldn't really count him. But Usyk, I would claim that AJ was a debatable top 10 pound for pound fighter when he defeated him, at least on some list. And Fury, although he got kicked off because of that awful fucking performance over Ngannou, he still was a top 10 level pound for pound fighter. He was just someone that had such a terrible performance because he had completely underestimated Ngannou. And Ngannou actually showed that he had more boxing ability than, what a lot of people thought. Now, of course, is that me excusing the performance of what a Tyson Fury had? No. But it was fairly obvious that Fury did not take that fight seriously at all. And even Terrence Bud Crawford and a lot of the other boxers had said that. They knew that Fury did not take that fight seriously.
At the time Crawford fought him, nobody was on the pound for pound list that Oleksandr Usyk has ever fought. At the time he fought him, right? I think Fury was on there at one point. But like I had mentioned, he got removed after the Francis Ngannou fight because he looked like complete garbage. This guy wanted to say Terrence Crawford has only fought faded world champions, or you could say out of majority of the top names.
And once again, these are the 5 levels that I'm going to talk about. So when we talk about, let's just talk about all of the potential A-grade level wins of both of their careers, at least what I would consider potential. And once again, I talk about 4 levels. I talk about peak level, prime level, faded level, and washed up level. When you talk about all the A-grade names or former A-grade level names that Crawford has fought, the guys overall that you would have to consider, I don't think that he fought anyone at 135 other than Gamboa that would be a true A-grade level fighter. I think that that's fairly obvious. Gamboa was someone that I'll say was at a prime form. I'm not going to say peak because A, he was clearly outside of that weight class. He did not belong there in the first place. And Crawford was a big lightweight. And on top of that, he was someone that, was, kind of off for a year. So I don't know if I would say peak version of Gamboa, but it was a mix between peak and prime. So I'll give him that. But I'm going to have to give him prime just because Gamboa overall was clearly outsized in that fight. And I would have to say the same thing for fights like Mikey Garcia versus Spence, Regenau versus Lomachenko, Chavez versus De La Hoya. Same standards. Cotto versus Canelo as well. But anyways, so all those fights would be more of a prime level, even though they still fought them at a great point. But the point overall is that, that's what I would count that as. Next one, I think would have to be Victor Postol. He fought Victor Postol at his peak. Now, how great of a peak that is, it's up for you to decide. In my view, a peak level of Postol is only an A- level fighter. But to be honest, a lot of the cruiserweights that Usyk fought, in my view, would only be A- level fighters. So to me, it's not really that big a deal. But anyway, so when you talk about those 2 wins, we have a prime and a peak win, in my view. When you fight Porter, it's a mix of prime and faded. It was kind of a mix there. Now a faded fighter, by the way, can still be an A-grade level fighter or even on the pound for pound list. It just means that, they're starting to head out the door. It means that they're kind of on their last legs. Like, for those of you that, I'm trying to think of a comparison. For those of you that may watch tennis or something like that, or anything like that, Novak Djokovic, that last year when he was winning, 3 Grand Slams, that was a faded version of a Novak Djokovic. When he won his final U.S. Open, his final Grand Slam, where he clearly was starting to age, that was a faded version of a Djokovic, but still the Djokovic that was the best, player in the world. So you can have a faded champion or a faded athlete, and they still be an A-grade level fighter. But a washed up fighter, no, they're not A-grade level anymore. But anyway, so Porter was a little bit faded, especially because of all the fights that he had and he was no longer a champion, but he was still at around a relative prime level. So that still was an A minus level win. Madrimov was at a peak level, but I mean, I don't really know how great of a peak level that is. I think he's about A minus. I think that once again, Madrimov and Postal, those two fighters, those are the same level, if not a bit higher that a lot of the cruiserweights were on when Usyk had fought them. And I think that that is a fair comparison. No, they weren't Spence, and no, they weren't Canelo Alvarez, but they were on the same level as guys like Postal and Madrimov. Murat Gassiev, Martis Bradis, those guys, Glavacki, they were on the same level as those two. Anyway. But then of course when you talk about a Spence, I would say a prime level. I'm not going to say a peak level, but a prime level, maybe a relative peak, maybe. But I don't think that either Crawford or Spence are really at their peak anymore. And of course, when you talk about Canelo Alvarez, that was a faded version of a Canelo, but still a top 5 to top 10 pound per pound level. But you can still fight a great fighter, and still be the better all-around fighter, because to be honest, Canelo fought a slightly faded version of Crawford as well. So the point is that you can still have a faded fighter, and they could even still be the number 1 pound per pound guy, but they still have to have some potential. Now, guys like Amir Khan and Kilbrook, those guys are washed up. They were no longer going to have any chance to win a belt. That's what washed up truly means. So there's a difference between faded, prime, peak, and washed up. Now, when you talk about Usyk, he fought Gassiev at his peak. He fought Glavacki at his peak. He fought Martis Bradis at his peak. He fought Michael Hunter at his peak. He fought Tony Bellew at his peak when he even had improved as a fighter and got those wins over David Haye. Although David Haye was, definitely faded in those fights. And in the second one, you can debate that he was completely washed up. In the first one, he got injured. So, I mean, that's up to you. But Tony Bellew was starting to improve as a fighter. So, I mean, that's up to you. It's either a B plus or A minus win in my view. But, it's up there. Marco Huck was in his prime. Maybe slightly faded, but around there. Tyson Fury was in his prime. I'm not going to say, maybe slightly faded. AJ, in my view, was at his peak because he ended up actually becoming better as a fighter after the Andrew Ruiz loss. And sometimes after a loss, even if they get stopped, they become at their peak. Lennox Lewis, for example, did not really hit his peak until he got stopped twice in his career. And then it would become after that when he would actually become the greatest version of himself. Even Evander Holyfield, for those of you that took a look at Evander Holyfield, he got stopped by Riddick Bowe very badly. And then that would win afterwards. He would beat guys like Mike Tyson and Michael Moore and even some other guys. So you can even get stopped in your career and still become a peak version of yourself. Take a look at Danny Dubois. Danny Dubois did not really become a peak version of himself until around that second Oleksandr Usyk fight. So once again, you have to know how the game of boxing works.
That he's beat, all of them were, washed. I can't name one dude that Oleksandr Usyk beat that wasn't washed. Every single dude of note at
Once again, Murat Gassiev, Glavacki, Michael Hunter, basically all the cruiserweights that he fought. Depending on how many A-grade level names he fought, in my view, it's at least a confirmed 3. But you can even go as high as 5, in my view, if not 6, if you wanted to. And at heavyweight, he for sure has 3. He has, what's his name? Fury, AJ, and Dubois.
heavyweight that he's beat has already gotten stopped. Other than Fury, right? He didn't stop Fury, but I mean, there's lots of debate between if Wilder really knocked him out, right? I'm not going to go there with it, but he got dropped by an MMA fighter. That says.
Well, I mean, people will say overall that he got stopped against Wilder, but to be honest with you, those people overall are really only the people that are majorly pissed off because they wanted their favorite black fighter to be the best heavyweight of the era. Now they say that, the heavyweight era is very weak, but they weren't saying that shit when they thought Deontay Wilder was going to be the best of the era. Before then, it was that Deontay Wilder has as many title defenses as Ali. Can you believe it? But then when Usyk and Fury were the best of the weight class, all of a sudden it's the weakest era. Like, get the fuck out of here.
When it comes to Fury, Anthony Joshua got stopped.
And I'm not saying that about this man Hitman. I'm saying that about channels like Dante and Ego and all those major overall racially motivated propagandists, blackity black channels. Those are the ones that I'm talking about. And let me also state this because people get the wrong idea. Whenever I say these pro-black channels, I'll just say, for now in the racially motivated black American channels. That's what I'm going to state because I'm not talking about every black American channel. I'm not talking about guys like, overall, what the hell's his name? I forget the man's fucking name. I forget a few of them, or even British channels. Like, I'm not talking about guys like Hatman Strikes Back. I'm not talking about guys like, God, man, what the fuck is that guy's name? I'll have to think overall. He's always another one that I think is really good, but I'll have to see about that. I'm talking about the LDBC and new media guys mainly. Those are the guys I'm fucking talking about, because those guys will say anything.
What's his face? Daniel Dubois, who has no heart and he's a big, huge, slow robot. He got stopped.
Well, Danny Dubois is definitely a little bit stiff, but he's someone that is very big. He's 6'4". He's powerful. He proved himself against Hergovich. Jarrell Big Baby Miller kind of came back. He was a fat ass in that fight for sure. To be fair, Jarrell Big Baby Miller was kind of a fat ass in every fight. But my point is that, this is the era of super heavyweights. And even though people will say that this is a quote unquote weak generation, take a look at Jared Big Baby Anderson. Jared Big Baby Anderson was looked to have it all. Then he fights someone like a Martin McCauley, gets knocked out within 4 rounds. So this era of heavyweights is a lot better than what some people give him credit for. Now, the era that really was as bad as what people try to say it was really the Vladimir Klitschko era. That was really an era that was full of fat slobs with beer bellies and, that were way undersized. That's why I don't put Vladimir Klitschko within the conversation as the greatest heavyweight of all time. Because who the fuck did he really beat within that era? I mean, give me a fucking break. He defeated some guys that were way smaller than him, overall, and guys that clearly overall were not the most talented in that. Anyways, this is going to be the second part because it ended up breaking off. I actually let my phone shut off. But Vladimir Klitschko, once again, for those of you that know me, I keep the same standards for all those fighters. Anyone who knows me knows that I am a stickler for guys that I find to be A, in a weaker era, and B, that I find to be, kind of weight bullies. So Vladimir Klitschko, once again, he was a part of a weak era. That's why you will never hear me ever say that Vladimir Klitschko, in my view, is the greatest heavyweight of all time. You'll never hear me put him in those conversations. Because Klitschko, although he is an all-time great level heavyweight, A, he pretty much majorly outsized everyone. And B, he was someone that really did not have any true challengers of his era. At least overall people that actually mattered and that could handle his size. Anyways.
And arguably,
But this era, once Fury and AJ and Wilder kind of reinvigorated it, once Fury took over the throne, that was when the era really started to transform. Because not only did you have Fury, but you have up-and-coming guys like AJ, Wilder, Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, and you still had some of the older veterans like Alexander Povetkin and other guys like that. You had up-and-coming guys like Danny Dubois, Joe Joyce, other guys like that. And I understand that people will say that, oh, those guys would have never became champions in the 90s. And hey, listen, if guys like James Bone Crusher Smith, Frank Bruno, Oliver McCall, if those guys can become champions, there would have been a decent amount of champions in this era. Trust me. AJ, Fury, Parker, Ruiz, Wilder, they would have been fine. And especially Oleksandr Usyk.
Would have been the undisputed world champion because I think he actually hit Oleksandr Usyk with a legal body shot that sent him on the floor.
Can't agree with that. Sorry. But in the replay, at least from what I've seen, it was very clear, at least from a certain angle, that Dubois did land a little bit low. But this is what I mean by this. Because if we're going to tear down someone's, things off of this, then we should also do the same thing with the Crawford.
And he needed like 10 minutes to get up. And you can go back and rewatch the replay. It was not a low blow. Clearly a legal.
I'm sorry, sir, but yes, it was a low blow
shot. But I'm just kind of talking mess right now. But when it comes to resume, there really isn't no debate, and there's people out there like boxing realists.
Well, when you talk about the debate, here's the debate, at least in my eyes. The thing is about Terence Bud Crawford is that, when you debate both of their resumes, now the thing that you can say about Crawford is that he fought those guys when they were on a pound-for-pound level. I think that Usyk still fought AJ and Fury when they were on a pound-for-pound level. I just think that Fury performed like shit in his prior fight because he didn't take him seriously. But of course, if you disagree with that, it's completely understandable. But that's just my personal perspective on that. I thought that it was fairly obvious that Fury did not take him seriously. But that being stated overall, when you talk about it, the debate, of course, would be is that both of them are 3 times undisputed. Now, one thing, of course, that would be in Crawford's corner is that not only did he fight Spence and Canelo when they were clear pound-for-pound fighters, even though, of course, one could debate that they were not at their absolute peak. But to be fair, I don't think Crawford was at his absolute peak either when he fought them. But they were still, at least Spence was at a relative prime to peak level. Canelo definitely was a bit more faded but he still was someone that was a top 10 pound per pound fighter and someone that was bigger than Crawford. So you have to give Crawford a lot of credit there. And I thought that Canelo looked in great condition in that fight. He just pretty much got outboxed by the better boxer with a combination of, I think overall him not being quite the same, but neither was Crawford, and he was good enough to win. So in my view, that's not enough of a valid excuse. Kind of the same with Fury and Usyk. But the argument, in Usyk's corner, you would have to debate that he's debatably beat more A-grade level names on his resume with the cruiserweights that he defeated that were very talented and undefeated. And then on top of that, he was able to do something that almost no fighter's been able to do by being the likes of a talent of a Tyson Fury and someone overall that was so much bigger than him and kind of beat the best heavyweight of his era. It would have been like, if Evander Holyfield would have been able to defeat Riddick Bowe, on all three occasions, or both occasions, although I don't think that AJ was quite as talented as a Riddick Bowe. But Fury is someone that was extremely talented as a heavyweight fighter. And AJ is as well. He's just not quite as swift, nor as talented as guys like a Riddick Bowe, but he still is a greater heavyweight fighter. He's still a great heavyweight. He will be remembered as one of the greater heavyweights within history. But that would have been like, once again, if Evander Holyfield was able to beat a Lennox Lewis of his day. Now, do I believe that Lewis is someone that, of course, is better than an AJ? Yes, but Fury is someone, in my view, that at his best would have been able to compete with a lot of the heavyweights in history. He is a great boxer.
Like to,
at least at his best.
Say there's a debate and, the resumes are actually really.
And some people overall may say, well, he got knocked down by an MMA fighter, right? And he also defeated Vladimir Klitschko, Wilder, and Dillian White when they were all, looked to be, as at great levels. So it's obvious that Fury at his best, overall is counted as a fighter. And one thing we can say about Fury that did not happen to, him, but what happened to Lennox Lewis or Mike Tyson is that he never lost to a 42-1 underdog like that of a James Buster Douglas. And he certainly didn't get knocked out by anyone who was not a champion before he gave them the championship, like a Hassan Rahman or an Oliver McCall. Two people who never really belonged with belts in the first place. But anyway.
Close, they're neck and neck. They're really not. They're really.
And I'm not claiming that Tyson Fury, in my view, is better than Lennox Lewis. But what I am claiming is that people will say that, Fury, these guys would have never lost to an MMA fighter, all sort of stuff. And, I get that. Fury performed like shit. But, once again, let's not sit here and act like some of those heavyweights that they did not have asterisks. Because Lennox Lewis got, clapped by two fighters that he should have not really gotten beaten by.
No. And like I think I mentioned earlier, when you look at the level of dominance between these two, Terence Crawford has either stopped his opponent or won by unanimous decision in every single fight. He's either stopped him or won by unanimous decision. No split decision, no draws, no majority draws, no majority decisions, unanimous decision.
That definitely is something that goes for Crawford, especially even in the biggest fights of his career. Now, what I will state is that when we're comparing it to Oleksandr Usyk, Usyk had, 2 split decisions in his career. But for anyone who really knew how to score those fights, they're not really split decisions. And I'm not, once again, throwing, shots at this guy. I don't even know if he scored the fights himself. But the point overall is that, a lot of people really do not know how to score a fight. And when you talk about those fights, no, I'm sorry, but the reason why Usyk really got split decisions in those fights is because he was not really expected to win either of those fights. They thought that it was going to be a good little Olympian name to put on AJ or Fury's resume. I think that they took him seriously by the time he got the Fury, but they did not actually expect that he was going to beat AJ. They thought that he was going to be a little bit too small, a little bit too hittable. And then when he actually proved to have the goods at heavyweight, they were like, wow, like we didn't expect this to happen. So they gave him, I believe, the unanimous decision in the first fight, but they really wanted AJ to win that second fight because he was the main cash cow. That's the only reason why there was a split decision there.
Or he stopped you, got you out of there. Not the same for Oleksandr Usyk. Split decisions here, majority decision, how to run it.
I understand what you're trying to say, sir, but that is a little bit disingenuous. Because once again, for anyone that has seen Oleksandr Usyk's career, and once again, not trying to throw shots at the man. Best of luck to this man. I have no issues with him whatsoever. But I do have to say that, over once again, the split decision against Fury and AJ, it really was not a split decision worthy fight. There are certain fights to where they'll give out split decisions to where we know that they're basically full of shit. Like when you take a look at the Sean Porter Errol Spence fight, that was a split decision. That was not a fight that needed a split decision. Like when you take a look at other fights, like that of I'm trying to think of other fights. like a Cruz versus Lamont Roach. Like that's not a fight that needed a split decision. That was a clear victory for Lamont Roach in my view, or a split decision draw with Fury and Wilder. That was not a fight that deserved a split decision either. So we also must know the difference of, deservable split decisions and split decisions that should have never happened in the first place. Like, when you talk about fights like, say, like I'm trying to think, Sergey Kovalev versus Andre Ward in the first occasion, that's a fight that is worthy of a split decision. When you talk about Golovkin versus Canelo in the rematch, that's a fight that could have been worthy of a split decision, but not Usyk versus Fury.
Back
Or Usyk versus AJ.
with Fury, had to run it back with Dubois, had to run it back with AJ.
Well, he ran it back with Dubois, but he didn't run it back with Dubois because he had a huge problem with Dubois. So, once again, let's not sit here and act like, he ran it back with Dubois because it just needed to happen. He ran it back with Dubois once again because Dubois later on would prove himself and he needed someone to beat, overall, because he pretty much had accomplished everything that he needed to. And that's why hopefully after this Rico fight, although I think this is a terrible fight, he's taken a little bit of a break. So I'll at least give that to him. Hopefully after that, we see a series of fights that actually matter. And hopefully he doesn't actually fight, Fury and Trilogy, because that's a fight that nobody really needs to see, at least not anymore.
Name it. To me, if you have to go through a rematch, and in some cases, when you look at Devin Haney and George Kambosos, that was a rematch that wasn't necessarily needing to happen because Haney washed him, right? But those were fights that there was no real separation, I'd like to say. Sometimes when you completely dominate a guy like a Haney did a Kambosos, there's obligations that you have to fulfill, right? But in the case of Terence Crawford, even when those obligations were there was no need for a rematch because his opponent really didn't want it. Canelo...
And that's something that you can say.
Can come out after Crawford says he's done and retired and say he wants to rematch. But how come he didn't do it for like the first 6 months, after the fight? Because he's trying to save face.
Well, there's certain people overall, once again, that say that Canelo, of course, did to save face. To be honest, this guy does not seem the biggest fan of Canelo, so I don't know if I can really take his word for it, but I'd have to see. To be honest, I didn't really research it because to me it didn't really matter that much because Crawford is retired and, I'm not really going to go that much into it because I don't think that Crawford is more than likely going to return anyway. And he has a right to do that because Crawford has basically accomplished everything that he needs to. I don't think that he needs to offer Canelo Alvarez a rematch. I thought that he clearly beat him, at least beat him 8 rounds to 4. And of course, obviously, he was at the disadvantage. So Crawford basically has the right to do whatever he wants to at this point.
And same thing goes for Earl Spence, who ended up pulling out of the rematch as well. Let the contract, expire. So there's really no debate when you look at these fighters, and I'm not... The thing is, I really don't dislike Usyk. It's his fan base that makes me dislike him. And then when you look at,
Right, but we have to be very careful with that. Because a dislike overall of a fan base, at least overall to, a super, emotional degree or fan, type of degree for any of us, can bring danger because that will ruin your objectivity and your logic. And, that happens a lot of the times with people, even me in the past, So you have to be very, very, very careful of that.
Some of the comments that are out there, saying Usyk's the great.
Now, don't get it twisted. Are there fan bases that annoy the shit out of me too? Yes, there are. The Deontay Wilder fan base, at times the Terrence Bud Crawford fan base, the Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade fan base. There's a lot of fan bases that have annoyed me over time. But, once again, you always have to make sure to keep things in proper perspective.
Heavyweight ever.
And in terms of the UFC fan base, the Max Holloway fan base is one of the most batshit insane fan bases I've ever seen in my life, which is why I'm doing a video on that very, very soon. But anyway.
Far more better than Terence Crawford, skill for skill, and it's not.
Well, that's also where I have to disagree with that as well. I don't, I agree with him here. I don't think that Usyk or Crawford are just majorly ahead of each other. I think that they're on a very similar level. So when we talk about, one person saying that these guys, that they're just way ahead above the other, to me, no, that they're on a very similar level. And they, in my personal view anyway, deserve to be remembered on a similar level. Because it's not like either or has a Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao type of resume. They have about 6 to maybe a little bit more A-grade level names. They're both 3 times undisputed, so they deserve a great amount of credit. And they're both debatably the best of their era. Now, Inoue is someone that, especially does not deserve to be there yet. He's someone that I think is getting there, but he still has some more proving to do against real A-grade level fighters. So we'll see. And he's fought some, a few A-grade guys, but he's going to have to fight more.
Not even close. And I don't know what you have to do on Boxing Realist's channel. I think maybe you have to be,
and this is the point that I really wanted to talk about right here,
Eastern European descent. You have to have a boring style, and maybe you have to fight in the weakest generation of heavyweights, or get beat by.
Well, Usyk definitely did not fight in the weakest era of heavyweights. That would probably be, at least when we talk about within that of the past, let's just say 60 years, that probably would have been Mike Tyson.
Every top guy that you've ever.
And Usyk, although he was in the era of super heavyweights, this era was very talented. And you had heavyweights from all sorts of skill sets and all sorts of builds. Once again, you had AJ, Anthony Joshua, you had Tyson Fury, you had Deontay Wilder, Joseph Parker, Dillian White. You had guys like Jared Big Baby Anderson, Martin Bakole, Filip Pergovic, Oleksandr Usyk, of course, Andrew Weiss. You had a bunch of fighters that actually had real talent. Now, of course, do they look the same as what they did 20, plus years ago? No, because they're just different. They're built different, so they're going to look different. But this is the era of the super heavyweights. This is no longer the era, once again, of the heavyweights that were only anywhere from like 215 to 230 pounds. This is the era of the 240 to 300-pound guys. And for their size, which is a major advantage in a lot of things, they are very particularly skilled, at least in this era. Now, the Klitschko era, no. But this era, yes.
Fought in Lomachenko, because he likes to praise Lomachenko and he likes to praise Oleksandr Usyk. Really, any Eastern European fighter. I believe he even tried saying Dmitry Bivol in Beterbiev forced Andre Ward to retire, which is blasphemy. And
well, no, sir, I've never said that in my life. So I'm not really quite sure where you got that from. In fact, I've made it a point overall to state that in the past that I've always thought that that was a point that really made no sense. Because Andre SOG Ward, who's also another all-time great fighter, by the way, around that same level as a Crawford and Usyk, maybe a bit below, just because I think that, he didn't accomplish quite as much as them, but still he's around that level, maybe a little bit lower. But the point is that it wouldn't make any sense to say something like that, at least not to me, unless you were just hating on Andre. Now, Andre is someone that, probably deserves his own criticisms. He was definitely a dirty bastard. He took a lot of tactics from Bernard Hopkins. But the point is that he was still a great fighter, an all-time great level fighter. And at the end of the day, I don't think it would make sense to say that he avoided Bivol and Beterbiev and that they forced him into retirement, because at the time, Sergey Kovalev was looked at as the creme de la creme and the best fighter in that weight class. It would be like me saying that Terrence Crawford beat Errol Spence, but then left the welterweight division to avoid Jerome Boutsenis. It just wouldn't make any sense.
In the same video that I'm talking about, right? He said that Bernard Hopkins lost every single one of his biggest fights, and that's complete bogus.
Well, listen, what I'm going to tell about, Bernard Hopkins, and I'm going to let him finish up here in a minute, to kind of address my thing about Bernard Hopkins. When I say that he lost every big fight, of course, I'm not talking about every big fight, but there are certain pound-for-pound fighters that can beat top 10 pound-for-pound fighters, and then there are top 10 pound-for-pound fighters that can actually be the best in the world. Bernard Hopkins was never, ever the best boxer in the world. Now, there may have been a time at middleweight where he was ranked as such, but he was never truly the best boxer in the world. And he was, kind of a weight bully at 160, which is why a lot of his fights there, although he was very good there, I don't really count a lot of them. And the reason why I don't count a lot of them is because when you're beating guys like Trinidad and De La Hoya, like, give me a fucking break. And he beat Glenn Johnson, I believe, when Johnson was undefeated, but Glenn Johnson would not even be in the conversation as a pound-for-pound fighter until way later on, anyway.
He beat up on cheating Trinidad, who had loaded gloves, who got caught, and he got stopped. When you look at...
Well, when we talk about Felix Tito Trinidad, a lot of people, they, of course, go on their theories, but pretty much from what I've seen, Trinidad did something that was called stacking. And there are certain fighters that even do that today, like in a way, and also Terrence Crawford, by the way. There is proof and evidence. Look it up. Don't just take my word for it. That Crawford, of course, has also stacked his hand wraps as well. He did it against Canelo and Spence, I believe, but for sure, at least against Spence. Now, there is controversy around this that it shouldn't be allowed because it adds more power, like a hard cast, and makes an unfair advantage. But the point is that in certain places, it is legal. So to me, it's not really a matter of conversation. Now, if you want to have the conversation about it shouldn't be allowed. That's your prerogative. You know, that's your perspective. But at the end of the day, you know, I can't really bitch, moan, and complain about it because if it's legal within the sport, then it's legal within the sport. But the point is that what Trinidad did, and even Nazim Richardson will tell you, is that Tito Ortiz was caught, you know, stacking his hand wraps at the New York Athletic State Commission. It would have been legal, you know, in any other commission, but it was not legal there. That was the difference. So, I mean, if you want to say that Tito was trying to pull a fast one, up to you. But the point is that that was way different, for example, than what Antonio Margarito did. You know, what Tito did was stacking, but it's legal in a lot of areas all across the world and also within the U.S. What Antonio Margarito did, you can't do anywhere.
Yeah, Bernard Hopkins, he went up and beat Antonio Tarver, jumping up multiple weight classes to do so.
That's great, but Bernard Hopkins was pretty much always a light heavyweight anyway. And I understand that certain people are going to get on my case about that, say, what are you talking about? He jumped up 2 weight classes. Right, but if Sebastian Fundora jumped up to 160, you know, right now, of course, that's not 2 weight classes, but that's one. But if you have a fighter that very clearly, you know, overall belongs in another weight classes, and if they jump up to that weight class, I'm sorry, but how impressed am I supposed to be, really? It was very clear that Bernard was not going to last at middleweight for for overall, once again, much longer. I mean, the man was a fucking light heavyweight. Give me a fucking break. And I understand that he made it into his 40s, so I'll at least give that to him. But Bernard was kind of a weight bully there. It's no offense.
Oldest champion in the sport of boxing. When you say Bernard Hopkins is, I guess you could say, overrated from what he's trying to say.
Which he is.
It's complete disrespect.
It's not really complete disrespect. It's just the truth. At the end of the day, Bernard Hopkins, yes, he can beat guys that were top 10 level pound-for-pound fighters. Guys that could be beatable, you know, like Antonio Tarver, Winky Wright, Felix Trinidad, who, of course, was decently smaller than him. You know, John Pascal. Yeah, he can beat those guys. But he's not going to beat Joe Calzaghe. He's not going to beat Roy Jones. He's not going to beat those guys. Any guys that could really compete with his size and his, you know, talent, he couldn't beat.
And same thing goes for Tommy Hearns. He was bagging on Tommy Hearns, too, saying he gets no credit for
Tommy Hearns on that same level as Bernard Hopkins. Tommy Hearns, once again, there's a reason why I put Tommy Hearns on the level that I do. Tommy Hearns was someone that was built like a fucking super middleweight and damn near lost almost all of his top 5 pound-for-pound fights in his career. The only top 5 level pound-for-pound fighter that he ever beat was Roberto Duran. And that was because Duran was about 5'7" to 5'9" with about a 69-inch arm reach, and Tommy Hearns had about an 8-inch reach advantage over Kim and a several-inch height advantage over Kim. And Duran started off at lightweight. Now, did he end up, you know, going all the way up to middleweight and, you know, winning titles there? Yes. But at the end of the day, Duran was a guy overall that really never belonged there in the first place. And on top of that, Duran was a guy that also would lose a lot of his bigger fights, moving up the weight classes as well. So although that is a great victory, it's not like Duran was just unbeatable when he would move up weight classes. He lost to Vinny Pazienza. He lost to Wilfredo Benitez. He lost to a lot of guys moving up weight classes.
Roberto Duran? Roberto Duran went up, I think, fought all the way up to 168 pounds. Started off at lightweight. Roberto Duran is a great fighter. But
Roberto Duran is an all-time great level fighter. But how much credit am I supposed to give Tommy Hearns when he loses all the big fights in his career with guys that are similarly sized, like Sugar Ray Leonard, Iran Barkley, you know, Marvin Hagler, you know, but the only top 5 pound-for-pound win that you ever get in your career is over a guy that very clearly is way smaller than you. I'm sorry, but no.
To not give him credit for beating, or not give Tommy Hearns credit for beating Roberto Duran is crazy, since
you, of course, can give Roberto Duran credit for defeating, or excuse me, you, of course, can give Tommy Hearns credit for defeating Roberto Duran. Just like you can give Lomachenko credit for defeating a Rigondeaux, or just like you can give Errol Spence for defeating a Mikey Garcia, or a Crawford for defeating a Gamboa. But it's never going to be as big, you know, overall as the wins over Spence. If Crawford had that win over Gamboa and Postol, but he never beat Spence or Canelo, he'd be talking about completely differently. So the point is yes, we have to judge the standards if you're able to beat fighters that A, are not only your same size, but also a little bit bigger than you. Because that's how we judge Ali. That's how we judge Mayweather. That's how we judge Pacquiao. You know, that's how we judge Leonard. So we have to judge Tommy Hearns and Bernard Hopkins off of those standards as well.
Roberto Duran went up to 160.
And we also judge, you know, Usyk off of that as well.
And beat Iran Barkley. It's just a joke, you know. And there's a couple other things that this dude said. And, you know, I think I'm ready to close the chapter on boxing realist. You know, I've kind of gone back and forth here and there.
And that's why, once again, for those of you that have also seen my channel, you would know that I also hold the same standards to Oscar De La Hoya. Because Oscar was, you know, people will say, oh, he beat up Chavez, he beat right. But Chavez was like a fucking 135 pounder, and De La Hoya was really a 154 pounder in the wing. So, I mean, you know, great. That's great that you beat those guys. But what are you going to do against fighters of your own same size? Like Devin Haney, for example. Take a look at him. You know, Devin Haney looked great against Lomachenko to a degree. He looked great against Kambosos, but then his fight against Ryan Garcia, he looked like shit. You know, and I understand that Ryan Garcia was on steroids and that Garcia missed weight, but that, to me, that is not a viable enough excuse to lose the way that you did. It was obvious that when he finally fought a fighter of his own similar size and height and reach, that he had an issue. So yes, you do have to judge those standards off of fighters.
But when you're arguing with a guy who has low boxing intelligence, you know, you're kind of the idiot for going back and forth entertaining it. So I think I'm done, but I wanted to post one video, you know, to kind of close the chapter on mine and Boxing Realist's, you know, debates here and there. You know, I think it's over with. But let me know what you guys think about everything that I just mentioned.
Best of luck to you too, sir. Nothing personal.
You know, and who do you think really has the better resume and is the better fighter? Oleksandr Usyk or Terrence Crawford? Let me know what you guys think. Hate, like, comment, subscribe.
Well, as for them, you know, in terms of who do I think is the better fighter, I think that it's impossible to quantify who truly is the better fighter when they are separated by such weight classes. But when you talk about who is the greater fighter, in my view, they're around the same level. Usyk is on the same level as guys over like a Crawford. Usyk is basically the greater version of Evander Holyfield, not necessarily with the way that they fight, but the things that Evander Holyfield dreamed of always accomplishing, Usyk actually did. So we have to give Usyk a lot of credit there. But anyways, that being stated, that pretty much is about it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later. And best of luck to Mr. Hitman Sports Media. Anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later. And if you have any comments, concerns, you know, I'll do a video, I'm sure. Anyways, but that's about it. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.